Well, folks, today we are talking about innovation, and whenever we hear that word, we always think of the kind of high-end innovation. It's got to do with sleek BMWs or iPhones or Samsungs. Sometimes innovation can happen in the messiest ways and in the simplest places. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands here, but in a group this size, I know that a number of people will be able to relate to the story. I come from a family that, when I was about 10, 11, 12 years old, struggled quite badly financially, and we were the odd ones out when I went to school. And I went to a decent school in a decent neighborhood, but there are those little things that give you away. Like when your dad picks you up in the afternoon and he arrives in his car, which in our case was a beaten up, broken down, rattle-trap station wagon that the kids called Puff the Magic Peugeot. You could hear the brakes squeaking from a mile away. It would inevitably break down and sort of turn into a heap right there in front of the cool kids. And my dad had no issues whatsoever with sort of singling out 4 or 5 guys and going, "Hey, come push." So this was our background, and when you are the family that struggles, you've got to find ways to entertain yourselves. Because the other kids are coming home with things like the PlayStations or the little quad bikes or whatever's popular at the time. We didn't have access to things like that. So my dad walks out into the backyard. And, as I say, you've got to find ways to entertain yourself, which is probably why myself and my younger sister exist in the first place. But once you've had the kids, you've got to find ways to entertain them. So my dad goes out into the backyard and he takes a look around to see what the heck does he have to work with. And there's only one thing that catches his eye. We've got this huge tree right next door in the neighbor's yard. And about 30 feet up, there's this massive branch coming across into our side of the world. And my dad thinks, rope swing. So he gets a rock. And he puts the rock into some sack. And he ties the sack shut. And he stands beneath this branch and hurls the rock and tries to get it over, and when he regains consciousness, he discovers that he's created something that became legendary in our neighborhood. You see, when most of us think of a rope swing, we probably think of like an old peach tree, and it's maybe half a meter of chain, and probably like an old car tire. And the kids play on it for about 10 minutes, they get bored, and it sits there for the next 20 years cutting through the branch and completely forgotten. This was nothing like that. For starters, you didn't sit on this swing. You held onto handlebars at the end of the rope. And what you did is you would run the entire length of the yard, holding onto the handlebars. And when you got to the end, your feet would come out from under you and you would swing up over the roof of the house on this side. Then you'd come back down, your feet would touch down, and you'd swing up over the telephone wires on that side. We had surprisingly few fatalities. And most of them were kids nobody really missed anyway, so it wasn't a big deal. Sometimes innovation happens in the most basic ways. People using their minds, looking around and going, what can we do? How do we make stuff slightly better? And it's really just all about having your radar switched on and thinking your way through life. And sometimes it's about not following the rules. We're going to talk today about how rules can sometimes get in our way. You and I have been blessed with supercomputers, this grey porridge that we keep on top of our shoulders. Scientists say, in spite of the amount of the galaxy that we have explored so far, that the single most complex substance we have yet found is your brain matter. We have never found anything more complicated in the universe. You have a supercomputer. So what gets in the way of our using this thing? Well, there are some interesting little traps that we get sucked into. And I catch myself doing these things all the time. So there's no kind of pointing fingers or blame or anything here. Let's just explore how our thinking works and how we can actually use it in our favor. Your invitation today is to be completely unreasonable. There's a guy named Ralph Waldo Emerson, an author, who said, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable man persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man." There are certain rules in life we have to follow. In this room, we don't have to today. What I'd like to do is to invite the unreasonable part of you to come forward here today. You know how psychiatrists like to talk about your inner child? I want to talk to your inner child today. And not in a creepy sort of can't sit on my knee sort of way. I would like to invite you to bring that wilder you, the one that looks at stars and yearns. I want you to bring that part of yourself to the session today. The unreasonable man and woman in the room. So, what goes wrong with our thinking? We start off by looking at stars and dreaming of being astronauts, and we end up living relatively small, boxy lives. Why? What happens? Sometimes, the thinking that gets handed down to us from one generation to the next becomes invisible to us. In other words, we can't see, we can't identify the kind of thinking that is normal all around us. There's some interesting research and an idea that's doing the rounds at the moment that basically says you will be about as prosperous and about as successful, about as rich as the 5 people closest to you. And I'd like to invite you for just a second to think, who are those people in your world? Chances are we're probably talking, say, boss, close colleague at work, spouse, husband or wife, boyfriend, girlfriend. Hopefully not spouse and boyfriend or girlfriend. And it's maybe like, your closest friend. Who are your 5 closest people? The chances are that you're going to be about as wealthy and about as successful as the median average of those 5 people. Why? Why does that happen? Well, it's because it's the thought culture that surrounds you. And our thinking is hugely determined, or our success is hugely determined by our thinking. So, what thinking gets handed down to us without us being aware of it? Take a look at the building that you see on the screen there. That's a factory out of the Industrial Revolution in England. What else does it look like that you might see in your world around you every single day? A church, perhaps? What else?
A hostel.
A hostel, okay, heading in the right direction. Anyone else?
Castle.
Here's a clue. How many castles have you seen today? And I don't mean the drink.
I don't think I spoke. Maybe that's all the kitchen.
I'll give you a clue. You may have seen one this morning. It looks like a school. Doesn't that look like the structure of a public school? The rows, the windows, the quads, the division. Think about this for just a second. Why do we have our schools organized to look and work like an Industrial Revolution era factory? Let me show you how deep this goes. You drop off your kids in the morning, the workers arrive in the morning. The teacher puts them into lines outside in the quad. The foreman organizes his workers. They blow the bell, he blows the whistle. They take the kids to their little workstation. The foreman does exactly the same thing. They sit at their little workstations at little neat desks in rows, and they produce for a number of hours. Then the foreman/teacher rings the bell /blows the whistle, and they may take out their little lunchbox. Now you go sit outside and you eat your sandwich for half an hour until what happens? The teacher/foreman blows the whistle/bell, and you march back in your lines and you produce for a few more hours. We're teaching people to work in Industrial Revolution era factories. Our schools are designed to do that. Now, my point is not just to pick on schools, and frankly, I don't have a solution to this. I don't have a better way. But what I'd like to point out to you here today is that we do things in a certain way without knowing why. We just look at it and go, that's how a school is. No, it's not. That's how a school is because Industrial Revolution era overlords needed that kind of worker. So they made sure the schools were that way to train the right type of person for that kind of job. We don't live in that world anymore. But that's how schools still look and think and operate. Sometimes the thinking handed down to us becomes invisible. I come from a scenario that was maybe one of the quintessential ways of showing how this stuff gets handed down from generation to generation. My grandmother gave my dad the only advice he ever got in terms of how to manage your work and your wealth. She grew up in Manchester, in England, in an old English manor house. Has anyone here ever watched Downton Abbey? Okay? Am I the only uncool person in the room? Downton Abbey is basically a soapy. What it is you've got this old English manor house around sort of 1910 to 1920. And it's 2 different storylines. It's the people upstairs, the kind of semi-royalty nobility, and then it's also the people downstairs, working in the kitchens, the staff, the scullery maids, and so on. Now, my grandmother comes from that kind of situation. She was not the people upstairs. She was the people downstairs. She was, in fact, a scullery maid in one of these manor houses. And it's quite funny to see the pictures today and see the outfits they used to wear. It was that full-scale, what we think of today as kind of a little French maid's outfit, with the little bib, the ribbon, and the feather duster, and everything that we now pay a premium to buy at Adultland. Of course, at the time, it was nothing like that. At the time, this was a uniform that represented a class of people who had no voice in the face of authority. They were raised and trained never to speak back. Don't ever think for yourself. Don't be a voice. Don't have an opinion. Don't have insights. What you do in your world is follow the rules. That is all. Now, that's how a person like that was raised in that kind of era, in that time, the working classes, and specifically women who had no voice in the face of authority during that era. So what happens? My grandfather died when my dad was very young. My grandmother had to raise him. He's about 16, 17 years old, and she gives him the best work advice that she can put together. She goes rummaging around inside her mind and comes up with this one. My son, get a trade, and that way you'll never starve to death. Who here has heard some variation on that advice in their family? Yeah. There's nothing wrong with getting a trade. There are people out there who are, say, plumbers who are driving Range Rovers. You can earn a lot of money that way. But listen to the second half of that sentence. Did she say, so that you can live out your God-given potential? So that you can enjoy your life? So that you can become something that matters to you and to the world? So that you can climb to the top of Maslow's hierarchy and achieve self-actualization? No. So that you don't starve to death. The thinking comes from a place of desperation. It comes from a place that says there are not enough resources to go around. You have to get the security that you want up front and stick with that, play it safe. In the same way that the schools are handed down to us, that kind of thinking comes down generation to generation. And it may have worked back then, maybe, certainly doesn't work now. The most prosperous people in the world these days are the big risk takers. If you, like myself, come from a working class family, the thing you probably fear more than anything else on earth is going bankrupt. Most multi-billionaires have done it 3 or 4 times. They don't care. It's a game. Money is a game to them. It's a scorecard. It's an energy. It's just a way of looking at the world. They go bankrupt. They bounce back again. They learn lessons. But for the working classes, we paralyze ourselves with fear. We become utterly paralyzed by the idea that going bankrupt is the worst thing that can ever happen to us. What's extra scenario thinking? Well, that's the guy, the woman who says, I don't care what the 5 people closest to me think like. I need to look at a bigger world than that. I speak on ideas around how to be an entrepreneur, starting small businesses and representing your brand. One day I land in Cape Town, and if you've ever flown through Cape Town, when you've just landed, or just as you land in fact, there are 2 things that you will see. One is breathtaking, and the other is completely heartbreaking. If I give you a second to think about it, you'll know exactly what they are. What's the breathtaking one? It's the mountain, absolutely. One of the 7 natural wonders of the world. What's the heartbreaking one? Right. You drive past the township. It's your first port of call, your first entry into one of the major cities that represents the continent of Africa. First thing you see is the ghettos, the starving dogs, the people at the side of the road, the hopelessness. And I took a drive past that one day, about to go and speak at a conference, and I thought to myself, how difficult is it to get out of that kind of situation? Can't they start small businesses, become entrepreneurs, and you eventually come back to this idea. The problem is not that there is no thinking available, no ideas available. The problem is each of those people is surrounded by 5 people like them. So the thinking is the same. You start a small business and others pull you back. And I mean, this happens around the world. It is one of the most difficult things to get out of poverty because the people around you think the same way you do. Extra scenario thinking is a little bit brave. It's like saying, how do people who are not in my reality think? Here's another example. If you're working class and you fear going bankrupt, how difficult would it be to look at a multi-billionaire and say they think differently, they don't fear going bankrupt? What's going on in their minds? Today I'd like to invite you to do a little extra scenario thinking. It's kind of like saying, let's take our hands out of the machinery for a little while. And let's zoom up to 50,000 feet and just look at the big picture and go, what else is there? How else could we think? What could be different? Now here's the really cool part about what we do today. Of course it's designed to apply to your world and your work, but it's also designed to apply to your personal world. You can use these kinds of ideas on how to innovate and think differently in anything. They're universal principles. So, what is the problem with following the rules and being excellent? Here's the answer. The longer you are excellent, the more invisible you become. It's one of the weird ironies of building a career. You do everything perfectly. And you've been doing it so perfectly for so long that no one notices anymore. When do they notice you again? Yes. When the wheels fall off. When everything falls apart. When you make that stuff up that you will remember into your 60s and 70s. That's when they notice you again. The problem with excellence is that it becomes invisible. Following the rules and doing things with technical perfection is not always in your best interests. And it's not in the best interests of this company or the brand. So, which comes first, the rules or the goals? This session is not about anarchy. I'm not just saying that we need to get rid of all rules and live like hippies. Peace, man. There are some rules that work in our favor. In fact, let's try and come up with a couple. What systems of rules do we genuinely need?
Driving on the left side of the road.
Driving. Okay, traffic. In fact, traffic is an excellent example. I live in Johannesburg and I love some traffic rules. I think that would be a very good idea. Yeah, you can't live without traffic rules, it becomes absolute anarchy. But even some of those traffic rules are a little bit ridiculous and actually get in our way. I'm going to put up my hand first here. I'll be the first one to volunteer. There's no law enforcement in the room. Who here has done an illegal U-turn? Why, you rebels? Was it useful at the time? Yes. Yeah. We have a rule in South Africa that says you may not do a U-turn. It is illegal, it is against the rules. In California, it isn't. They've realized that it's useful to do a U-turn. So the way that it works is the line stops at certain points and they have arrows that indicate here you can make a legal U-turn. How useful is that? They've decided that helping people to get places and making traffic flow is more important than having a rule. In fact, sometimes the rules can be so counterproductive that they can be deadly. For way of example, has anyone here ever actually been to Cairo, to Egypt? Yeah. Someone was telling me the story, and I have to assume that it's true. And I'm going to try not to laugh because it's actually terrible. So, he's in this little van, and they're touring through the middle of Cairo, and he hits a pedestrian. And the guy in the back of this van is now mortified. They've hit this guy who's lying in the road. So, the guy in the van goes into first and drives over it. Then he goes into reverse and drives back over it. Then he goes into first and does it the third time. The guy in the back of the van is mortified. What on earth are you doing? He explains. There's a rule here that says that if you hurt or disable someone, you have to take care of them for the rest of their lives. Wow. Talk about a rule getting in the way of its own goal. This happens all the time. We try and find formal ways to make things happen, and they actually do more damage to the cause than good. Sometimes rules get in the way of goals. They're actually counterproductive. Gut feel test. Right now, in this organization, in your world, you don't have to answer it out loud. I just want you to think about it for a second. What do you reckon gets priority? The rules or the goals? Interesting. Okay. So, why does that sort of thing happen? I absolutely adore this photo. I think this sums up most big corporate companies. You see, what happens here is that the manager, who is terrified of a human being doing something wrong, puts the boxes over their head and will not tell them what they are doing. So, the instruction to this guy over here becomes, run forward 3 steps and kick. That is your job. Provided nothing changes, running forward 3 steps and kicking will work. But if anything changes, anything at all, that will be completely ineffective. This guy will follow the rules and fail to meet the goals. What we want in an ideal world is a team of intelligent people all using their supercomputers who all know that they are playing soccer, not just that they are running forward 3 steps and kicking.